Welcome, everyone. We're glad to have you here joining us for the Arboretum Waterway Flood Protection and Habitat Enhancement Project Community Info Session. And I'm joined by Andrew Folks, who's an Assistant Director at the Arboretum and Public Garden, as well as the Director of the UC Davis Riparian Reserve, and Emily Griswold, who's our Director of Gateways Horticulture. Emily is going to help us facilitate the webinar logistics of this. She's going to be watching the Q&A and making sure that we're catching people's questions and helping out with the kind of behind the scenes stuff. And with that, I think I'll get us rolling. So we're going to do some quick introductions and meeting logistics, and then we're going to jump quickly into talking about the project. We've saved a little time at the end for Q&A, so if there are questions we haven't answered throughout, we'll make sure to try to catch those at the end and try to wrap up by 8. If we aren't able to answer your questions during this session, we are going to share our emails, and we'd love to continue the conversation with you in the future. So our goals for this evening are to share some details about the vision and the design of the Waterway project, as well as the timeline, and answer questions that you all have and hear from you while we're in these final design phases of the project and before we begin construction in the fall. This is being recorded so that we can share it with folks who weren't able to be here at this time. And your options, my understanding of your options in this webinar format is that you can raise your hand, and Emily will be watching for that. And the Q&A is the area where we can answer questions. So Emily just sent a little message about that. So as far as quick introductions, the UC Davis Arboretum and Public Garden has a purpose of inspiring human potential to help people and environments thrive. And when I say UC Davis Arboretum and Public Garden, we're talking about the campus's 5,300 plus acres, which includes the historic Arboretum, which is about 100 acres of demonstration gardens and scientific collections, as well as the Poudre Creek Riparian Reserve, which is a stream and grassland ecosystem, which is managed for teaching, research, wildlife, and habitat protection. So when we talk about Arboretum Public Garden, we're talking about all of those places. Arboretum is that 100 acres on the south side of campus where the Arboretum Waterway flows through the middle. And today you are going to get to hear from Andrew Folks, our Assistant Director at the Arboretum and Public Garden, and myself. My role is the Waterway Steward.
All right, so I'm going to give a real brief waterway history, and I say brief because the geologic history of the waterway spans many millennia. So the Arboretum Waterway, as you know it today, is historically been a segment of the old North Fork of Poudre Creek. The banks of Davisville, founded on the banks of Poudre Creek because of easy access to water to pump into surrounding agricultural fields and for municipal use. But of course, being next to a river means you would occasionally flood. And so the South Fork of Poudre Creek was created and fully cut off from the North Fork in the late 1950s, around the same time as Monticello Dam. So about 1958 was when the levees on the south side were created. And that effectively cut off what is now the Arboretum Waterway, the historic channel of the North Fork of Poudre Creek, from the live functioning channel of Poudre Creek. There's a minor pause as I control the slides remotely here. So there we go. So the next one, this is the segment of the project and the segment of the North Fork of Pewter Creek we're talking about, because it's the low spot on campus, it's now a critical part of the campus stormwater infrastructure. So about 900 acres of the urban core of the campus drains into the Arboretum Waterway, and then is ultimately that stormwater is pumped down into the campus stormwater system into discharging into Pewter Creek. And you can see the hatched area in here on the screen is part of the project area. Now, this is, you can barely make it out on the screen because of the age of the photograph and the fact that the sky was not blue at the time. But you can almost make out the water tower, the campus water tower here on the upper right in the photo. You'll see these sort of vertical legs of the water tower to give you an idea of how much change there's been in the channel historically, right? This is where the Arboretum paths would be. This would be the area near the law school. At the time this photograph was taken, this was where the channel was still in kind of its natural form, even though it was disconnected from the main channel. It still had kind of its original topography. And this is where Lake Spafford is right now. You can actually see Marac Hall there on the upper right. And so imagine that, right? No redwood trees planted. The building is fairly new. It's just kind of the edge of campus, very, very rural. And you can see the historic emergent marsh wetlands here in the stream channel, the historic stream channel, as well as the old branch road, running along the top. That actually is in the Mary Wattis Brown California Plant Garden right now would be where that path is. And this is looking at the Pewter Creek Lodge Bridge. You can actually see this is the barbecue pit, that rectangular object there. And this was during construction in the 1960s of the what we call the current Arboretum Waterways plan form. This was an excavation project that was designed to create more of a recreational style feature that at the time, versus a more natural habitat, this was really more of thinking of it as a park and as an ornamental water body than really as a habitat source. And this is pretty much in the same area, or actually on the bridge looking at this, but you can see more of the kind of present day configuration where the side slopes are concrete coming down to the water being flat. And when I say flat, I mean the entire 1.5 mile length of the Arboretum Waterway prior to phase 1 and prior to these projects that we're proposing. It's all flat. So think of it not really as a stream, but as really just a long pond. And that's part of what has caused some of the issues that we're facing today that we're hoping this project deals with. And then, of course, over time, that spray on concrete treatment, which was largely done to prevent erosion, but also, kind of when you're thinking about a channel, it was in vogue to channelize the waterways at that time. And, that starts to deteriorate. It's not really structurally sound. There's no reinforcement inside. It's really something sprayed onto the earth. And so you get water that runs behind it and starts to undermine it. So this is the sort of thing you see out there today. It's not terribly attractive. It doesn't provide habitat. It doesn't provide a planting medium for any kind of habitat enhancement. And so this is, again, sort of the current condition that you're seeing out there. And then, of course, we have gabions. Apologies here. The gabions that are kind of the bank revetment in other areas. So not all of it was spray on concrete. Some of it was these rock and wire baskets as the erosion control. The unfortunate part about that is over time, the rock will, or the wire will corrode. And so the rock starts to fall out. So you're left with these kind of wire mats along the edges. Also not very conducive to doing habitat restoration, but also for wildlife. We have, turtles and ducks sometimes get caught in there. It's not terribly safe if you want to go down there to do a habitat restoration project because you have these pieces of metal sticking out. And so again, this is part of the historic idea behind bank revetment and channel stabilization.
So as Andrew kind of started describing there, that 1960s design created this large stagnant pool with a lot of high nutrient still water, a lot of nutrient input, but very little uptake. And that still water leads to algae and odors and water quality issues. And also those concrete edges reduce our ability to create habitat along the edge of the water, as well as reducing infiltration. And then the amount of water storage that we currently need on our campus wasn't designed into that 1960s system. So we now have some issues with flooding of buildings and paths on our campus. And these issues have been a concern for many years. The Arboretum conducted a self-assessment in 2001. And the goal was it's part of our planning process for the future of the Arboretum. And in order to complete that process, we had to set aside the discussion of the waterway because it was the primary thing people wanted to talk about. This was a big community assessment with lots of interviews and surveys, and people were really concerned about the waterway, and we had to say, we hear you. We're going to set that aside so we can talk about management of the land and our plant collections. But it really revealed the major concerns that there were with the waterway. And now we have the ability to manage the water in partnership with campus utilities and are in a position to do something to change that system. So I want to acknowledge the many years of campus input and community input that have happened, community planning that have led to this project. So much work from UC Davis faculty and staff and volunteers and community members led us to be able to propose and get funding and support for this current project. This is looking at the waterway when it was covered in duckweed, and some quotes from our participants, which are sort of amusing now. But again, not something we wanted for the Arboretum Waterway, and one of our concerns. Flooding, of course, is the other major concern, and the waterways is the primary component of our campus flood management. So UC Davis's stormwater system master plan includes this project as a critical backbone for the receiving water from the entire campus. And all the other stormwater improvements we do ultimately flow into the waterway. And this affects our libraries, our research facilities, our bike and pedestrians paths, and even our city streets. And so currently we have limitations in the Weir system, the outfall Weir, where the Arboretum releases water to Puda Creek through a series of pumps that will cause water to back up those stormwater pipes and then sit on streets and paths in campus. And so this picture is at the Arboretum proper, and you can see that bench and sign are underwater when they should not be. And this is actually on Russell Boulevard, where water had backed up those stormwater pipes and is sitting on the street because it couldn't drain out quickly enough. So to address those issues, this project is protecting campus from flood damage, people and property. It's reusing recycled water and stormwater for habitat and groundwater recharge. We get to restore an urban stream and riparian habitat. And we get to do that by providing workforce education and training for disadvantaged communities. So we really have this incredible opportunity to transform the Arboretum Waterway from a stagnant detention basin with insufficient stormwater capacity to this incredibly vibrant wetland habitat and riparian corridor that's going to capture stormwater and filter nutrients and utilize recycled water from campus. And looking at sort of the whole project moving forward, project area is a little over 9 acres. And the length is about 1.25 miles. We get to restore 3 acres of wetland and riparian habitat. And the way it's designed, we're going to increase the capacity of the waterway by 6 acre feet. So imagine a football field covered in 6 feet of water, 6 acre feet of water. And so again, we're doing these multiple benefits. We're addressing the flood concerns. This is another picture from the middle of campus where the water's all the way out to the middle of the street. We're replacing 36,000 square feet of concrete with native wetland and riparian habitat. We get to restore those 3 acres of local native streamside habitat. And we get to increase recreation opportunities and volunteer opportunities for the community. And again, we're at UC Davis, so we are learning lab for courses, not just UC Davis, but all larger community, providing jobs and training for UC Davis students and community members, research opportunities. Right now, there are research studies on fish and turtles and water quality happening in the waterway. And we get to involve community members in this work. So our Arboretum's Learning by Leading internship program will be involved in the process of this project, as well as the Sacramento Region Conservation Corps and the Center for Land-Based Learning SLUES program. And last but not least, we're addressing some water quality concerns by lowering the residence time, so keeping the water moving through the Arboretum, and increasing our nutrient uptake with plants, and also shading the water with more plants so that cooler water equals less algae growth.
All right, so Nina and I are going to give kind of an overview of the project itself, both historically what we've done to date, as well as what we're planning on doing with the award of this grant. And this is one that I'm going to linger on for a little while before we go into the next slides, because it's kind of the nexus of the overview of everything we're planning on doing. So you'll see on the right side of the screen where it says completed, that's phase 1, and that's on the eastern side, the upstream, if you will, part of the Arboretum Waterway closest to the city and the gateway. That section's been completed. And you can see at the bottom of this image, you see this dashed blue line. And that dashed blue line represents kind of the static water elevation of the entirety of the long pond that the Arboretum Waterway is. And those solid blue lines show the sort of stair stepping that we're doing to create flow and gradient. And this came about when we were tasked with saying, basically, let's solve the problem of the waterway, right? People don't like it. It's green, it's stagnant, it smells bad, it looks bad, fix it, right? And so we went out and we looked at it, and we came back and we told folks, well, there's nothing wrong with the waterway. And they said, well, what do you mean? It's horrible. Don't like the way it looks. It smells bad. It's got algae everywhere. And I said, well, it's not that, it's not what you want, but it's the system you have. You've got a warm, high nutrient laden water body in the Central Valley that's the recipient water of all of this urban runoff. That is functionally stagnant, has a lot of solar exposure. And when you have all those things combined, you create a system that's basically a big pond that has algae in it. And so we went out and looked at, well, what would you want this to be? And the analogs in the region for something that we're proposing here is Puda Creek proper and Cache Creek, right? They're both fed largely by rainfall, warmer water, a lot of nutrient load inside them. But the water surface itself doesn't really have, outside of, say, stagnant pools, doesn't really have the surface algae that you have in the concentration in the existing waterway. And so the solution to the symptoms that we were seeing is to change the system. So instead of having a flat 1.5 mile long lake, we actually stair-step this with gradient, and through a series of recirculation pumps from about the center to the east, we create continuous water flow. And that movement is enough to prevent surface algae from forming. And I have to remind folks when we talk about this concept is we're not going to end up with like a Sierra stream because that's not the system we have. It's not even the geography that we have, right? We have about 200 species of algae in the water column, and that's okay, right? We're going for creating something that has a much broader habitat benefit than the existing waterway as it is. So what you see on this exhibit where there's this blue hash, that line represents all of the increased passive flood storage. So instead of having to remember to lower the waterway significantly before a rainstorm, and if you forget, then you end up with some of the flooding issues that you see, or to keep it perpetually low and then have all of those exposed concrete banks. By reimagining this with the design that we have, which you'll see in the subsequent slides, we create this passive flood storage where we get all of the habitat and this flowing stream, and that 6 acre-feet of storage in that area being highlighted, that is part of the flood protection for the campus. And it gets absorbed by both the vegetation as well as that 15 inches of capacity that we have on the far west end where the bulk of our volume is. And then that allows the water to take the peak off of those flood flows and allow more to flow through the system.
All right, so this is the section. We're kind of zooming into the 4 different sections that we sort of think about this project in. And this is the part that's been completed. So that was in about 2017 under construction. And there are 5 weirs in there and 1 circulation pump. So it sends water up to the east end, close to downtown. And this is kind of what it looked like when it was under construction. So we drained the waterway, dredged quite a bit of accumulated sediment. We did this during one of the wettest winters we've had in a long time, so that was a little challenging, but we learned and we know how to manage that for our future work. You can see it's very muddy in there. And these weirs are the structures that allow us to have this stair step, this water, keeping the surface of the water falling and moving so that we don't have that mats of algae buildup. So this is on the left, the weir when it's finished, and then on the right when it's full of water, and you can kind of see the water fall down the middle and the surface of the water moving. This was right after a little rainstorm. And then the weirs, once they're vegetated, have become great little habitat zones. And once we were sending moving fresh water up there, the fish came back up to that zone, and then the birds followed because they're fishing. And so this is an egret who's hanging out on the weir, picking off fish. One of the other changes is replacing those rock gabions, those cages full of rocks, with native California rushes. So on the left is pre-project, on the right is post-project. Then again, a sort of a pre and a post. Before we could move the surface of the water, we had some buildup of algae or duckweed in the summers and those rock gabions on the edges. And now we can keep that surface water moving and have that vegetation on the edges.
That's one of my favorite photos, Nina.
Nice
I love doing that. Yeah, that's a side-by-side taken from the same location. So now we're talking about the stuff that we haven't built yet, right? So this $5.4 million grant with the 2.55 campus match is going to be funding the remainder of this. And you'll see it denoted in places as like phases 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that was because when we originally designed this, we divided up into 4 distinctive sections that had 4 distinctive solutions. And we also anticipated, based on available funding sources, that we would probably do these in pieces. However, this grant is allowing us to build all of this as one project. It may be over several summers, a couple summers of construction in different portions, but you'll still see the remnant phasing language in places in some of these graphics. So the main thing to take out of it is the phasing doesn't mean it's going to each be done separately in a different year now that we have this one big overall grant. So the next portion that we're looking at to describe kind of the whole project is what we're now calling the Lake Spafford portion. And so this is very similar to the phase one, if you will, the east end, where we have a recirculation pump that takes water from downstream and moves it upstream. And this will take it to about the place where the phase one pump is. And the reason that we have these stair-step pumps is that the fresh water, when it's not raining, that keeps the waterway full, is campus recycled wastewater. And that wastewater is very clean and it's highly oxygenated. And so as each of these pumps gets installed, those pumps get closer and closer to that water source. So the next one that you see that, we'll see phase three, right? That pump is right next to that water source. And so it will take it up to the phase two pump, which takes it up to the phase one pump, which takes it to the east end. So as each of these come online, the water starts getting cleaner and cleaner further to the east. What we really notice, which Nina mentioned about the egret, is when we didn't have this project in place, the first phase, dissolved oxygen levels at the far east end were at 0. It was completely anaerobic. And so without any oxygen in the water, you didn't have fish, you didn't have turtles, you didn't have the ducks looking for the fish. It was completely stagnant and anoxic. And so as soon as we turn on phase one, which took water from Lake Spafford, which is a little closer to the water input from the campus recycled water, the oxygen levels rose because they were higher in the Lake Spafford area. So all of a sudden you've got oxygen in the water, the fish can move in, and the birds follow. So that was kind of our proof of concept, which really helped as we were going to the state saying, hey, we're looking at doing this for the rest of this. We've already proven that it works in the first phase. So this one, the objectives of this are to remove some sediment to increase some storage. It's been 20 years since this segment was dredged. And so over that time, we have several feet of accumulated sediment, and that sediment's largely organic matter that comes in off of the rest of campus, so leaf litter and that sort of thing. We're creating 2 additional weirs to create that gradient and flow and continue that design. Adding the pump to improve the water flow. So this time from behind the law school up to the east end of Spafford. We're creating a riparian bench for wildlife habitat and erosion control. So on the side opposite from where the big grand lawn is that comes down to the concrete edge, we're maintaining that lawn and that edge because that's really part of the aesthetic of the urban interface with the waterway. But looking across there, you now see all these broken concrete. We're actually going to create a 5-foot wide bench that we'll be planting with emergent marsh vegetation, and that will be the erosion control from wind wave action against the bank. So we're going with a bit more of what they call green infrastructure for this round. And this is the vegetated earthen bank. So as that concrete gets removed, we'll have earthen banks in the place that'll be a shallower slope that we will then be able to vegetate. So this is the existing conditions. This is again from the lawn looking across. You can see there we go. There's our nice concrete lip. And here's kind of a photo simulation of the before and after of the same location. So you see the plant there and there. And so the idea is we create a bench that sticks out into the water. More of the rushes that Nina and her team have been establishing will be planted on that edge. So you have a much more natural edge as you're looking across at the native plant garden in Mary Watts Brown.
And so we keep moving to the west. This next section, which we used to call phase 3, is kind of a narrow section, so we're calling it the West End Channel. It goes from the law school to that recycled water input. And this section, there's going to be fairly minimal disturbance in here. We are going to remove some sediment to increase that storage capacity. In the future, there'll be the rock weirs to create a little gradient and flow, but they won't be the big concrete weirs. And that one pump, again, pulling water from right where that tertiary treated recycled water comes in, that really highly oxygenated clean water, pulling water from there, moving it up toward the law school, and again, pulling it up with the next pump, pulling up with the next pump all the way to the east end, and bringing that fresh water throughout the waterway and keeping that surface moving. and then revegetating the banks after we pull out those gabions. So again, in this section, those rock gabions have completely emptied themselves of the rocks. The wire has degraded and the rocks have fallen out, and now we just have this like pokey wire. So replacing that with vegetated banks like we did in phase one.
And this is a great set of photos too, because it is literally the before and after in phase one. So when we were talking about proof of concept, we said, yeah, this is what we're talking about. These were the weirs before, or the, not the weirs, the gabions. And this is the same bank, revegetated, but this time with native vegetation that Nina and her student team have been installing throughout the length.
Yeah.
So the final piece of this puzzle is the West End wetland. Now this is everything to the west and downstream, if you will, from where the tertiary treated wastewater input is. And so we don't need any pumps in this section because it's all gravity flow. And so there's one final weir in this segment. As you can see here, the little orange thing that denotes a weir. And this is the area near the boathouse and Putty Creek Lodge. There's sort of the large lake that's out there now. And we'll still keep that water feature, but it will be slightly different in the design. So similar idea here, we're removing some sediment to increase the storage. And interesting thing about this, because removal of all that really rich organic material, that's one option, right? But we're actually looking at deepening that lake. And then as we create these floodplain benches, we're going to mix the native soil beneath the lake with the sediment. And in doing that, create some really rich substrate for growing the plants on those benches. And we've already done the geotech studies and done the boring samples and done the engineering on this, such that we know that that sediment mixed with the native soil will be a really good, stable, but also nutrient-rich place to plant. So we're kind of recycling all of the 20 years of sediment that's come in. One weir, as I'd mentioned, is gravity flow. We're having lower water surface elevation to create those floodplain benches for wildlife habitat. And this is the one where, boy, this is where a lot of concrete is. And we'll replace that concrete with vegetated earthen banks. So we're trying to have like a 3-to-1, more gentle side slope coming down that's more easily plantable and maintainable that comes to these floodplain terraces, and then a narrow river channel where we're basically right sizing the channel for the amount of water that we get in a low flow condition, but still having the capacity to handle what we'd call flood flows or stormwater flows. And then we're also putting in a check dam at the far west end. Right now we have a weir, but it's very difficult to control the water because it's a big screw gate. And so when you open it up, it opens from the bottom and the water comes out. And so you can't really control your elevation of the water very easily when it's draining at the bottom. It's like, imagine trying to control the water height in your bathtub by, sort of moving the stopper a little bit at the drain. And you're never quite going to get it right. And so then you're adding a little water and then you're subtracting a little water, or you're closing it and adding it. This check dam will allow us to put in these flashboards, and we'll be able to control the water surface elevation perfectly. So if we want to flood those floodplains for watering the vegetation using the water that's already in the waterway, we can do that by adding a flashboard, wait a little bit, floods up. When it's done, we pull it out. Or if we want to mimic what's going on naturally in a wetland system like the Yola Bypass Wildlife Area, we can time our flashboard installation to time with what might be the best for both wildlife habitat as well as for some of the vegetation. And this is where we have more room to establish a riparian forest and marshland. And you'll see that in some of the images. And we're creating, as I said, that narrow low flow channel to reduce stagnation. The idea is if you have a narrower channel, the water's moving a little quicker through it. And so then you don't have as much residency time of the water, which means it's less time for it to stagnate, less time for the algae to form. Right now, with the volume of water that we have coming in, say in the summer through the wastewater plant, it takes about 7 days to move water through the system. That's functionally stagnant. That's not moving very quick. If you think about how short a distance that is and how it takes 7 days to do that, I'm thinking I could probably crawl that distance. So here's some photosim images to give you an idea of what we're looking at. So you might recognize these areas. You've got the Arboretum Teaching Nursery in kind of the upper left, Putah Creek Lodge parking lot kind of in the center top, and Putah Creek Lodge is just above where that text says concrete banks. So kind of get your frame of reference. This is the big lake area. And right now, not a lot of water movement because of the size of both the channel coming in and coming out of the lake. So this overlays our engineering drawings. You can see these contours show a deepening of the lake. So the lake right now is barely about 4 feet deep. We're going to be deepening this center to almost 15 feet. And that gives us the soil that we need to mix with the sediment to create these floodplain terraces. And those are kind of that slightly olive green that you see. And those are the areas where we're going to be predominantly doing emergent marsh with some riparian vegetation kind of near the back edges of them. And that 15-foot depth also creates the cooler water that'll be really good for the native fish. And so we're going to be working with our fisheries researchers on campus in creating the right optimum conditions for some things like sack perch and other native fish that we don't have the habitat for in this very shallow, warm system right now. And then you see the channel is slightly narrower there as it leaves the lake area. And that's where the water will pick up a little bit of speed and move through a little bit faster. And then this was kind of an artistic rendering of what it would look like after vegetation. So you can see where the emergent marsh is at the water's edge. And then you have the riparian that kind of fills in the gaps within that canopy. Then this is a photo simulation of that lake zone before and after. So this is kind of on the northwest side where you've got a nice overview from the path. And while the view is very, very pretty because we have a wonderful arboretum, you can see that concrete edge, that lip right there, and the lack of really any kind of water stream side edge habitat or emergent marsh. And in the image below, you can see where we have the peninsula coming out there. We've got a softer, greener edge. We've got additional riparian plantings along there. So think of this more of like you would have in an actual natural wetland system, but within the urban zone as part of a stormwater system. And then in the far west end, and you can see in kind of the lower left there, this sort of half arc that's the final weir that the floodwaters spill through, which also has the screw gate. This area becomes much more of an emergent marsh area. And then this is where we think there's going to be a lot of wildlife viewing for birders who want to go out there and see more of the species that are dependent on denser marshlands. So you can see the engineering drawings here. We're putting in kind of a braided channel like you would have an alluvial fan, larger floodplain terraces, shallow earthen banks coming down that will give us the opportunity to revegetate with riparian species. And then you can see here sort of the final artist rendering of the green being the emergent marsh wetland, and then the dark green riparian vegetation with the narrower stream channel moving through. And again, when I say swift, we're not thinking a roaring mountain stream here, thinking something more akin to lower Putah Creek or something you might see near, say Pedrick Road or something like that.
And this is sort of another view of the waterway from, if you were to slice a little section of it, trying to look at it from the side and thinking about what kind of vegetation we're going to have, this sort of multi-story riparian vegetation on the edges, on those slopes, and then on those floodplain benches, more of that wetland vegetation. And then that channel, that main channel that'll stay water, that's our low flow channel, we call it. So that's where we're trying to get water to move more quickly through the system, be able to flood those benches when we have a storm or when we want to water those wetland plants. And so that's kind of what it would look like from the side. And again, all the plants that we're going to be planting in this area are local California native plants appropriate for the Putah Creek watershed. This is an image, sort of photo simulation of the very west end of the Arboretum. So again, there's another big lake there. And once we have that channel built in with those wetland benches or islands, you can see on the bottom illustration that we'll have a lot more emergent marsh vegetation, the more large trees on the edges, and then that channel moving through. So again, that increases shading of the water, cools the water off, more nutrient uptake by plants, and significantly more wildlife habitat for a more greater diversity of birds and invertebrates and insects. Speaking of wildlife, we have an incredible team that handles our permitting and prepares our protocols with the state and federal agencies to ensure compliance with those environmental protection laws, and know from our work in phase 1 how to protect those species that we have concerns about in our area. So nesting birds under the bridges, or state species of special concern like our western pond turtle. We have western pond turtle in the Arboretum, which is the only California freshwater turtle, which is very cool. And so we have our protocol in place to protect them. And one of those will be just draining not the whole Arboretum at once, right? But being able to drain sections and then moving the wildlife that can't move on their own to the wet sections of the waterway. The ducks, and the birds can make it on their own to the areas they want to be, but the other ones will move for them. And again, we have our team of specialists that help us set those protocol and follow them, and then know from our experience in phase 1 how we'll plan that for this new section. And thinking about the timeline, we're expecting to begin construction in late 2022, so later this calendar year, and continue through the next calendar year. And in each section, our revegetation and habitat enhancement will follow the construction. So, construction is like big, heavy equipment moving earth around, draining the waterway. And then once they're all done with that, we come in and add the plants. And that's where we get to involve our community members and our students in that process. And we are so fortunate that we have that Arboretum Learning by Leading program and those internships that get to be involved in these projects, so that we have paid positions for undergraduate college students, as well as course credit for students, and this career and leadership development, so training students in these real world projects so that they're prepared for their careers in environmental stewardship careers. We also get to work with the Sacramento Regional Conservation Corps. These are young adults ages 18 to 25 who are getting workforce training. And then also the Center for Land-Based Learning, SLUES program. It's a local nonprofit that partners with high school teachers and habitat restoration projects. And these students get to be involved in a series of field days with the Habitat Project, seeing it progress over time, as well as tying that into their science curriculum at school. So we're really excited to be able to involve all of those pieces in this project and the revegetation, and using it as a learning opportunity as well.
Now, we've also done community engagement as we were getting closer to finalizing kind of ideas and concepts, but we wanted to get community input. So we held a couple open houses at the Wyatt deck, and kind of went through that with our engineers and project managers, got to give an idea and answer questions with folks. This project we've been conceptualizing and doing the studies and analysis on for the last 10 years. And then built, the first phase in 2017. About 2016, we were doing these outreach, and we meet with the Friends of Davis Arboretum board as well, which gives community input. They meet quarterly with Arboretum Public Garden staff. And since I believe about 2016, those updates have included what we've been doing with the waterway, as well as holding events like this. The funny thing about a lot of this too is when we run into community members and they hear that we're working on it, the first thing they do is, oh, thank you for dealing with the waterway. And so that's been nice to hear, particularly the feedback on getting the first phase completed, just the transformation of it. We had one person who was from Texas, who was an engineer doing a project on campus. We were taking him around to look at different infrastructure. And he saw the first phase that we completed, and he said, "This looks like the San Antonio River Walk." I thought, wow, I don't think he would have said that a few years earlier before the project. So we've had some pretty good feedback from the first phases, and that's why we're having community input like this as well, as to get any questions that folks might have related to this. And as Nina said, there's going to be a lot of potential for community engagement with this.
Right, so we have the opportunity with all of this new energy around the waterway to increase volunteer opportunities. And we have an incredible volunteer community with the Arboretum, and people who dedicate hours every week helping us maintain and enhance the Arboretum. And we are excited to be able to build a team that focuses on the waterway once we are getting into this project, and have the opportunity for folks to get out there and plant and play in the mud with us. Also, an opportunity that comes up with this project is, we got this $5.4 million grant from the California Natural Resources Agency, and have funds from UC Davis to contribute to the construction of this project. There are also opportunities for these enhancements to the project that don't fit within the bounds of the Urban Flood Protection Grant, such as a boardwalk, or wildlife viewing patios, or platforms, or interpretive signs, or benches, all of these sort of features that make visiting a place more engaging and an experience. And so we are going to continue to be reaching out to our community and promoting those opportunities to add to this sort of reinvigoration of the waterway. And as we continue with this project, we're going to make sure to have updates on our website about project progress. We do a lot of blog posts. We'll make sure to talk about the detours if they have to happen around the waterway. There'll be sections where, because of the construction, we need to route people around the large equipment for safety. We also have our email newsletter. So if you haven't signed up for the leaflet, I encourage you to do so from our website. That will feature news about the project as well as other happenings in the Arboretum. And of course, we'll have signage out physically in the Arboretum as the project continues. So thinking about all of that, this project is really hitting a bunch of things for the Arboretum waterway. This increasing our stormwater capacity and flood protection, improving the water quality, replacing concrete with native vegetation, restoring this wetland and riparian habitat, using that recycled water and recharging it into the ground, having this incredible urban wildlife habitat right here on campus, taking the opportunity to incorporate students and training, job training, increasing our recreation and volunteer opportunities for community members, restoring our urban stream habitats. Again, like having this really close connection to these incredibly valuable and actually rare habitats. And the great thing is we've done it before. We have our phase one to have learned from and point to and say, we know how to do this. And then lastly, because we have visitors from all over the world, we get to showcase this multi-benefit project and highlight green infrastructure as a way of thinking about our landscapes and our urban landscapes. And so with that, we want to thank you for being here and for participating and listening and being interested in what we're doing with the waterway. Andrew and my emails are here, but we also want to be able to answer questions from y'all in this moment while we have it. So this is our chance to hear from you. And Emily, I think, has been keeping an eye on the questions for us.
Yeah, so there are a few written questions that I was hoping that you all could answer. One of the first questions was, how many kilowatts to run the 3 pumps? Do they need to run continuously or possibly only when renewable electricity is available, such as sunshine and wind?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm actually trying to pull up the pump specifications to be able to answer that. And I might not be able to get all of the, because, not being the engineer that designed the pump section. I do know we use.
The engineer may be in the audience.
If that's the case, then boy, that'd be great, because I'm looking at it, I'm like, well, I know it's a 208 volt, flight series pump that's supposed to be 25% more efficient than previous ones, but I can't find the amount of amps that it uses. So if we have someone who can answer that, that'd be good. But I can't answer the first part of it, which is how long it needs to be on. So we found in order for it to work properly in terms of keeping everything aerated, we are running the pumps continuously, I'd say, with the exception of when we get the high storm flows, because obviously we don't need to have water recirculating when we're getting water input from outside the system. And the idea of turning it on only, say, when we have that renewable source like sunshine or wind, sunshine in particular, because we have a very large solar farm on campus. Most of the biological oxygen demand occurs at night. And so we really need to run those pumps at night in order to keep the oxygen levels up high. And for folks that have known the waterway for a while, have seen those occasional times when there would be these fish kills after the first flush of water, or first flush of the storm water that comes in. When the sediment goes in, the biological oxygen demand increases and the available oxygen decreases. So as a result of both, one, this project keeping higher oxygen water in more segments of the waterway, Nina's also worked on installing aerators so that we have a continuous amount of oxygen coming into the water system, particularly during those flood events.
All right, I have a couple more questions, and then there's an attendee who has raised their hand. So another question is the sediment in the waterway contaminated? If so, would you use the sediment to mix with the local soils to build the substrate for the riparian vegetation? And I guess maybe the question is, are there any problems perhaps with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we actually, as part of the sampling, we have this kind of grid of coring that we did through all the length of the waterway to be able to get samples to look for whether or not there are any contaminants. And there was only one very tiny spot where we found, I think it was nickel or something like that, that was the contaminant that we did not want in the rest of it. And so we're actually dealing with that separately, whereas the rest of it, no contamination in the rest of it, and being able to create the substrate by mixing it won't be an issue.
All right. We do have a comment in the chat from our engineer for the projects, and he said the pumps are small 7.5 horsepower pumps, and they are variable frequency drives, so they are very efficient. The total usage is low, but can be completely run by solar PV when needed. Not 100% sure of the kilowatts offhand. So there you have it. Okay, so I wanted to.
However, we should also say, if anyone wants to know the exact pump we're using, if you want this pump for your own pond project, I can drop it in the chat, and maybe.
All right. As you're doing that, I'm going to ask the next question.
Yes.
Marshlands progress to being meadows. How much maintenance will the marshes close to the outfall require?
Mhm.
Well, a lot of that has to do with how one manages the water. And so what we're looking at, and again, we're going to be very adaptive about how we manage these things, is how we time the flooding for decomposition of some of the tules and those beds that we have, what the natural progression of the ecosystem is. And if it becomes a meadow, that's not necessarily a bad thing. We're hoping that we don't get as much sedimentation because, again, we reduce the residency time and keep the water moving. So hopefully it will not have as much fall out and create that layer that we have. Largely in terms of the maintenance, there's going to be probably initially a lot of weed control. I think that's going to be probably one of the primary things Nina and her team are going to be dealing with, which is a larger team. So it's not just Nina going, oh my God, 3 acres of new planting area. And there may be times where we have to go in and remove some biomass that accumulates. We do have equipment to do that. We don't know how often we have to do that. I can tell you that right now, the sediment cycle for the existing system, every 20 years, we've been having to dredge the waterway. And we're at about 20 years since the last time it was done. It was 1998, 1999. So we'll see what the future cycles are, but we do anticipate with any kind of habitat like this that's in an urban setting that it is, even though we're creating wildlife habitat, it is in a very manipulated system. There will be some future management. We do not know exactly what that is yet, but we do know we have the staff and equipment to do it.
One of the benefits with this system is that those inputs from storm drains are the storm water is coming in from these storm drains, and we have our whole department that is sweeping the streets on campus and preventing a significant amount of that debris from making it into the waterway. So we have a whole system of cleaning those storm drains in the streets before they fill up and send it to the Arboretum Waterway. So that's one prevention technique for keeping that sediment out in the first place. But we do know that there will be continued maintenance inside the channel. Just don't know the interval yet.
All right, we have an attendee with their hand raised, so I'm gonna allow them to speak. And it looks to me like Jacques Franco. Welcome, Jacques. You can unmute yourself, and if you have a question, this is a good time for that.
Hi, Emily. I didn't intend to ask questions.
Oh,
but I think it's a great program. I think that Andrew already answered the question I had in my mind about those benches and how they're going to be managed over the years. And I think you're going to play it by ear. It sounds like.
Yeah, we call it adaptive management, but sometimes it's called seat of your pants. But and the idea is you have a good idea of what it is, and you've done your work with all your consultants, and you go out and you do the project, and then you basically you monitor it, you learn from it, you adapt what you're doing, and it's a continuous cycle that works toward the end goals that you've started with. And sometimes those goals change based on what the ecosystem does, particularly, in this climate with climate change, us having a reliable water source of campus recycled wastewater is going to be really huge if you think about us making wetlands in an area that's getting drier. We're going to start having some really valuable habitat for migrating waterfowl in this area. And I'm hoping that other municipalities create similar projects because we're going to need it in the future. And so we're really excited on sort of getting at this early and creating such a space.
Thank you.
and I'll just jump in on that, Andrew, and just and thank you, Jacques. So I just want to piggyback on that and say that this is part of our larger work with the Arboretum and Public Garden on our living landscape adaptation plan. So we're looking at how can we do these climate adaptation projects with our landscape that help us prepare for climate change. So we just have a minute left in our hour. So this, I think, is a great opportunity just to thank everyone again and let people know that we can stick around a little longer. If you have any remaining questions, you can raise your hand and we can address those. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Yeah, thanks for being here. We're really excited to make this transformation of the Arboretum Waterway and to a more ecologically beneficial habitat and a more functional stormwater system. And we really appreciate you being part of this journey with us.
And you'll be able to follow this on our the webpage, as Nina said. We'll have blog posts up there. There'll be continuous photographs, and even Nina and her students are setting up photo monitoring points. So we'll be able to watch the progression of this thing into the future, from before we even start work to during work to after work, and be able to see that transformation and put that together, in real time. But then imagine 5 years from now being able to do a sort of stop motion view of the progression of this into this this sort of urban, riparian, and wetland habitat. All right, with that, I think we're call it a close.
Yeah.